Hello CIS27. In this video I'm going to go over Unit 4 task and notes and assignment. So for this week we are covering Chapter 4, which is the expanded from what we cover in Chapter 3, which was network and protocols. And this week we're going to touch on different devices in the network. So in our task we are going to look at different types of attacks, and in addition to what we covered last week, we're going to talk about how to configure and install network components and also going into the wireless area. We're going to talk about security issues and how to troubleshoot some of the common security issues and implementing protocols in networks. So in Chapter 4, we are to read the chapter. We are to complete the assignment and the lab along with attempting the practice quiz. You can use all the prior assignments and materials along with the review game in order to review for your quiz, which covers the prior 2 chapters. So to start, we will take a look at the Chapter 4 notes. You can find that on the next page after the task page. And in the notes, it begins with talking about securing networks and different type of network detection system. You should concurrently use the assignments with the notes as you watch this video. So in the beginning, we are going to cover host-based intrusion detection system, which is HIDS. And this is an application-based type of detection system. So it is a software that provides protection for the system, the host. It is designed to detect attacks and potential or critical operating system files that are going to be at risk. It also monitors network traffic or traffic to the network interface card. If you use a wireless adapter, it also monitors traffic to the wireless adapter. It also helps detect malware. It is a way that we can provide additional protection for the system, and it's going to monitor applications and protect local resources. So a lot of the security application that you see today, like AVG, Avast, I use Avera or McAfee, Norton, those type of system like Symantec, the application itself encompasses a lot of the areas that address security means for the host. It's supposed to address the malware. It looks at additional protection, including updates to reduce vulnerability for the system, along with protecting the local resources, your storage, and your files, along with the system files. The second type of detection system is the network-based intrusion detection system. This is used to monitor network activity. This type of system doesn't detect anomaly on individual system or workstation unless it has a significant impact in the network itself. Hence the name network-based intrusion detection system. So in the case where there is a breach in the network or there is some form of attack against the network, we would be able to detect that with the NIDS or the network-based intrusion detection system. It's not able to decrypt encrypted traffic. So if an attacker uses encrypted traffic, it will bypass the NIDS. It does give you the overall monitoring and analysis. So it gives you the overall understanding of your network health. And it detects attacks on the network looking at ports and taps. So as you remember from last chapter, we talk about port as a value that's assigned to a specific connection point that would be pertained to a service, hence protocol. So in the case where it's going to take a look at all the services and especially the port that relates to the services, if there is an attack that's going to be aimed toward a certain service, then we would be able to identify it using NIDS. Now, it should be placed inside the network. So within the network, you would have this appliance connected within a local area network after your border firewall. So inside the network, we should have an appliance that would be in charge of detecting anomalies that would be specifically for network traffic. So right below it, I provided a diagram, as you can see. On the left, we have web server that's going to be communicating, so that would service the pages when the user would visit our web page. And we would have a database possibly to work with the web server for accessing records that would pertain to the web services. And inside our network, we would have the critical backend server like DHCP, DNS, Active Directory or directory services for users and systems. And in this, what we would have is we would have a firewall that's going to protect. It's going to screen for the internal network. Then within this side of the network, we also have multiple network intrusion detection system that would pertain to various segment and purposes for that type of network. So in this case, we would have two. On the left-hand side with the web server in the database, because this is going to be placed in a DMZ, what we want is we want to also have an NIDS that's going to be detecting for these servers on the other side, on the left side. And in addition to that, we have an additional firewall. So this router is designed to route to two areas of the network. The first area of the network is the critical area for operation that's on the right hand side, where the users, the systems, and the operation exists. The second area of the network is the other area that would be web-based for operation, and that's on the left hand side. And in both areas, you can see that we would place the NIDS in various locations that will be able to detect any kind of network intrusion through our network traffic. And IDS in general is used to detect attack, but it cannot prevent attack. Hence the name Intrusion Detection System. It's only going to be able to provide a report if an intrusion occurs or an attack occurs. It does not prevent or block the type of attack, so you want to use IPS instead of IDS if you want to prevent attack. Now, for the first question, we should answer what are the differences between IDS and IPS. IDS is used for detection and IPS is used for prevention. IDS does not prevent attack. And both of these fall under the category of responding to an incident. So it is a reactive type of security measure. As in, if an attack occurs, we are able to detect the attack using an IDS. If an attack occurs, we're able to prevent an attack using an IPS. So we should implement systems and measures that would allow us to have more preventative approach versus completely reactive approach. Because reactive approach only, that might be too late as they already entered your system or an attack has already occurred. So IDS would be used concurrently with IPS. In some cases, you would find appliances that would be equipped with a detection type of tool and also a prevention feature on that particular all-in-one appliance. However, those type of appliances would be higher in cost. So for number one, we want to mention that IDS is used for detection and IPS is used for prevention. IDS does not prevent attack. And to go back to our notes, we would continue with the description for the IDS. So with the IDS, we would be able to determine the traffic only if it is in band. So whenever it's out of band, the traffic does not go through, or it becomes what we know as passive. Now, the detection system is determining the behavior. It's based on either behavior or signature. So the signature is defined and stored in a database for the known vulnerabilities or attack pattern. And this is only based on what has been defined in the actual database itself. So it would have a storage location where it would have the signature already predefined based on the vulnerabilities or the attack pattern. And as you know, there's different type of attack that's being utilized against the network. So it would look at specific type that would be already defined, such as if we are facing a denial of service attack, looking at the type of protocols and the services that would be impacted in our network. A second area it can detect is based on behavior or heuristic. And this is based on what we would establish as a baseline. So in order for the system to effectively detect any kind of abnormal behavior, the baseline needs to be established. So what it would do is it would gather the normal operation system or network baseline. It can also be established by defining that based on historical data. So based on the baseline, which is your performance for overall operation at the minimum level or at regular functionality for your network, if anything outside of that normal condition, it would consider to be abnormal and it would raise a flag as a detected area. So now this type of detection is effective for zero-day exploit, which means that there would be the vulnerability already existed in the software or the system before it's released, and at the day that it's released, which is the first day, attackers or unauthorized individual would try to exploit that system or the application that would fall under the zero-day exploits. Now, what we want to establish when we're using this system is to look at data trends. And we want to analyze the data trends based on the logs. The logs that are generated, which include timestamp, the type of services, the type of data that's being transferred, your network traffic. So we can build the data trends and looking at the logs. And this system also provide a report mechanism where we would look at what is the outstanding based on the rules that's established. And from there, we can reconfigure or improve the rules. We can report based on email or log format, so it can send to the email or it can generate a log format where we would be able to skim through and read the log based on that for auditing purposes or even evaluating our system on a regular basis. Now all systems are perfect, as we know that systems sometimes would have false positive. That means that it would alert on an event that is non-threatening or harmless. It would raise our alarm even on a harmless event. False negative, it does not detect active or live attack, so it does not see an attack as a threat, an attacker as a threat. So false negative is when it doesn't detect any kind of attack or any kind of threat, where false positive is that it sees small event or non-threatening event as a threat. So now we would tend to lean toward false positive. However, that would generate some issues with administration where you would have constant flags that would raise based on a non-threatening or harmless. So the effectiveness in using IDS is really establishing what is considered to be either a baseline or the signature of what you've seen as vulnerabilities or attack, and then to be able to constantly making adjustment so that way we don't have either false positive or false negative. We have to have a medium. So for the next question, we want to answer for number 2, the differences between false positive and false negative. False positive alert on an event that is non-threatening or harmless, and false negative does not detect active attack or see as a threat. And so in order to implement IDS or any type of security appliance, we want to evaluate our rate for false positive and false negative. And so that way we want as close to accuracy as possible, and we want our system to be more effective. So therefore, false positive and false negative rates are important. In the next part, we're going to talk about IPS, which we saw in number 1. Intrusion prevention system is an extension or an extension of an IPS. It's able to detect, react, and prevent. So compared to an IDS, an IPS, an intrusion prevention system, is able to prevent and react to an incident. Now, it's used in line with the traffic. All traffic passes through IPS in band. So that means that we have to incorporate this as with the flow of our traffic, how that's coming in. So having a firewall, the firewall is going to set the rule, but most companies, they would put a prevention system right near the edge. However, that can create some bottleneck where it would prevent more of the traffic coming in. Depending on the IPS, we wanted to make it effective where we would set the rule on what it would block or prevent. And in the case where if the system is being targeted, it would also be able to detect. So active IDS can block attack, but IPS is placed with the internal network or on the edge of the network, as I mentioned. So we want to have one IPS, at least one IPS on the inside, and at least one IPS at the edge of the network, following between the public and the DMZ. So that will be concurrently with the firewall or adjacent to the firewall. And so in recommendation, we wanted to put it before the firewall so that way it would inspect all incoming traffic, and the firewall would also do additional filtering as the traffic is being passed inside into our network. So going back to our previous diagram here, if we are to put an IPS, it would be placed right here, right before our edge firewall. And we can also place an IPS in addition to this area here. So physically, that will just be on one rack. However, we simply, on the topology level, the layout of the network level, we simply isolate it, as in we would put in specific areas. So when you attach the appliance, for example, if we want to be able to attach it, we would include it, we would attach it with the switch that would be then attached with the router, or if the router has the connection, we would also attach it to that. If you want it to be attaching to specific server, we can attach that to a switch and then attach the switch to the server. So on this side, we should include an IPS. And then on this side, we should include the IPS before the firewall and also an IPS inside. So in addition to this diagram from what we see with the IDS, we need to include at least 3 more IPS to be able to effectively protect our network as it's designed. So on the last point here, it says IPS can be placed with the internal network and on the edge of the network. So that way we can inspect all incoming traffic and all traffic that's being utilized within the network. Now, for the next part, we should talk about Ssl and Tls Accelerator. In the last chapter, we touched briefly on SSL Secure Socket Layer, and TLS is the replacement of SSL. As you know, that most of our web-based traffic that would need encryption utilize TLS currently. Prior to that, it would use SSL. So in order to enhance the traffic, we can use TLS Accelerator as most of our encrypted traffic are streamed in or streamed out. The hardware devices that are handling the TLS traffic is known as the TLS Accelerator. Now this would be placed as close as possible to related devices, and often you would see TLS Accelerator being placed in the area of web-based traffic. So when we're looking at the prior diagram here, we want to put the TLS Accelerator on this side, as we would receive a lot of traffic for our web to service our web pages and our website, and accessing our database for those user accounts, etc. for our web services. So on this side, we want to include the TLS Accelerator that would allow us to be able to manage the encryption keys for the secure sessions that would be for our HTTPS service or our web services. Now, with using SSL, we can also use Ssl Decrypter, and this is often used with the NIPS, it's the Network Intrusion Prevention System. It's used to decrypt and encrypt traffic for inspection. As you read earlier, the inspection of traffic is important to the IDS. So with the network IPS, it needs would need to have the decryptor if it doesn't have it built in. So this allows us to decrypt the encrypted traffic for inspection. Otherwise, traffic cannot be inspected internally by the IDS in such case. So this is also a feature that can be equipped with the appliance, like the Network Intrusion Prevention System appliance, or if it's not, it would be a separate tool that would be needed in the network environment. So for the next question in our assignment, question 3, it asks you, when should we use SSL and TLS Accelerator? Whenever that there is TLS traffic that's implemented, and that would pertains to encrypted web traffic. And you often see this with HTTPS or other form of protocol that will be used for web-based, secure web-based. You know, if we wanted to implement FTP, secure FTP, and last week we touched on those protocols, and you have experimented with the lab using some of the protocols that would have security. So for Accelerator, we would implement that in the area that we need for encrypted web traffic, and especially for our web servers or any kind of servers that would be used with encryption, like TLS. Then next, we're going to talk about SDN. And SDN is defined as software-defined network. It uses virtualization technology to route traffic instead of using actual hardware routers and switches. So in a data center, you would likely, or even in a local area network, you would likely have a router, some switches that might be functioning at a higher layer of the OSI, so that way they can route to different parts of the network. But using SDN, simply we would use a software tool with virtualization technology to route traffic instead of using the actual hardware router. This allows us to separate or segregate different part of the network, and it also allows us to forward or block specific type of traffic in different areas of our network. And that simply we would define or identify the data path. So using a virtualized environment, we can segregate or separate the data flow into our network and how the data is being transmitted across the network, but by simply setting up the planes with the control from the SDN. Now, in this particular tool, it uses attribute-based access control, which is the Abac model. This is a set of rules that's going to be established for traffic route. So, for example, we can set up where certain segment of that network, for example, finance department, as they process user loans or customer loans, to be routed to only specific area of the network where the rest of the people will not be able to access or utilize. So we can set it up through the static route or the actual SDN itself. Now, for honeypots are being used mostly to test. Honeypot, it would be dangerous to be implemented in a network if there's not appropriate measures. So the name honeypot really is to entice or lure attacker, and this would divert the attacker to a separate part of the network. And we would use this to test or observe the different types of attack to be able to gather additional intelligence or build knowledge base against our network. Many administrators advise against honeypot in that if you lure the attacker into your network or get to part of your network, likely that they might be able to find their way to other part of the network. So when you implement honeypot, you have to be very careful in your network architecture and how that will the different measures and protection that you have inside your network. So from the point of the honeypot across to other separated area of your network, we want to make sure that we have all the protection measures in hand. Otherwise, it would defeat the purpose of security inside our network and outside of our network. So this is used for testing and also gather intelligence to build more knowledge about what could potentially be the form of attack against our network or who would be the attackers. In the larger group, honey nets would be a group of honeypots that would separate the network or would be separated in network or zone. And often you would find this set up in a virtual network to attract the attackers, like I said, but also to make sure that you have protective means so that way the attackers doesn't cross over to your other part of the network. So in the second question, in the fourth question, it asks, The purpose of Honeypot is to lure attacker or divert attacker to a system or an area of the network. In our notes, after the Honeypot section and Honeynet section, it goes over your 802.1x security, and this pertains to IEEE 802.1 for authentications, and this is for our Ethernet and going into our wireless. So 802.11 is for your wireless. 802.3 is for our Ethernet, and for 802.11, what we would see with the access point for the wireless is that we want to correlate the access control to different areas of our network, such as wireless. Port-based authentication protocol allows, the access point would usually require the user or device to authenticate in order to connect. And at enterprise level, we don't want to use the pre-shared keys. We want the user to have a user account along with the password in order to access that part of the wireless. So to really implement the security, we have to think about the physical and the logical side of our network. Physical meaning that how we would be protecting different physical location, as in which access point is in charge of which location, and how we would be able to block certain wireless traffic in other parts of the network. So for example, when you enter a hospital, you would see a guest network where that would be made public for the user or visitor, or temporary visitor workers that would come to the facility. Then on other areas of the hospital, you would see that there will be access point that would allow the nurses, the physicians, the healthcare workers to be able to access different type of systems on that wireless network. So for example, a doctor would be able to use his tablet to be able to document patient diagnosis and upload that documentation to the database record or the database server. So what you see is that at that point, what we would have is for the nurses and the doctors, for the internal wireless network, we want to make sure that it's not visible to the public where people would be able to see it or access it. Second, we would require the user to authenticate to be able to access that part of the wireless network. So that way we can track and log who's accessing at what time and what device. We also want to filter or add in the devices that would be authorized to be accessing that part of the network. So for example, all the nurses' workstations, the mobile workstation on wheel, the laptop or the tablets that's being used by physicians, and also different type of monitoring systems that will be used on patients that will be wireless or IoT. So that way we can detect if there's a rogue device that's trying to connect physically to the port with the cable or to the actual wireless access point using a wireless adapter. And in which that every time that the device is connecting, that device needs to be authenticated, or the user needs to be authenticated on that device to the port numbers. So on the access point, we're able to set that up with the access control list, the ACL, to be able to list all the allowable devices, to block anything outside of that allowable device list. And we also need to require authentication, possibly with username, password, or even on a higher level, we would use smart cards access token, facial recognition, etc. Now, the last point to that is that we can control the server by segregating our network virtually, which in that we can establish a VLAN. And a VLAN can be operated on one physical switch concurrently with the regular LAN. An exception that we would set up separate subnet addresses that would allow that network to be on as a smaller network within our large network that will be segregated from the rest. And in order to access that virtual local area network, it needs to be routed and the user has to be authenticated, or the system has to be authenticated. With the wireless basics, we know that in order to access the wireless, the device must be connected to an access point or a wireless router. Not all routers are access point. So we also have some systems that are specifically just designed for access point. Now, access point is has routing capabilities, where wireless routers are access point, but not all access point are wireless routers. Some access point would just be used as a form of repeater to the rest of the wireless network, where the wireless router are access point because it's able to route, but not all access point are able to route. As I mentioned, some access point are just to repeat the signal for the rest of the network that will be wireless. And each access point or wireless router would be connected physically to wire at a certain area. Like at home, when you're looking at your home wireless network, you need to have an Ethernet connection, which is a cable that's connecting to an Ethernet port that would then be connected to a wall jack, or in some cases, if you have a DSL modem or a cable modem, you would have a cable, which is a round cable that has the needle in the middle, that will be connected to the internet service provider line or your box on the outside. Now, so all our devices, even though they provide wireless service, needs to be physically connected to a wire somewhere in our network. And access point needs to be connected back to a switch that would then be connected to a router for the rest to be routed out and routed into our network as far as traffic. Now, FAT-AP is considered to be a standalone intelligent autonomous access point. This allows the client to be connected to the network, and it must be configured a little bit differently, separate from the rest of the other access point. So autonomous access point is more of a standalone access point compared to other access point that you see in a network, like at Moreno Valley College or at RCC. Those access point are not FAT-AP. They are just simply access point that's connecting to the rest of the network to make wireless access available for the students, the faculty, and the staff. And in industrial area, you would see FAT-AP, or in the larger zone area, you would see FAT-AP. The thin AP are controller-based access point in that we would see in most of our network environment, and those are not standalone and they can be managed by controller. So your access point in a local area network would fall under the thin AP compared to FAT-AP. So the local area network uses thin AP. There are two primary bands for wireless. Currently, when we're using 802.11ac, we're using 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. So when you have higher frequency, like at 5 gigahertz, you are actually having shorter signal length, meaning that if I'm having high frequency, I cannot send that signal in a very long distance. It has to be short distance. For the lower frequency band, 2.8 gigahertz, we can use it for longer distance. Most of your wireless devices like smart TV, your IoT devices uses 2.4 gigahertz compared to 5 gigahertz. So it would be safe to say that we can add most of our devices will be accepted on this frequency, and then some of the devices as needed we can put it on 5 gigahertz. Now 5G doesn't, in order to get 5G to be expanded across a longer distance, it needs to be repeated. So the repeater in what you see with communication company like T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, etc., they would build in these towers that would be repeating or devices that would be repeating across the long range distance for 5G access. Now, these are managed by the IEEE. For the channel width for the 802.11ac or for these two bands is at 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz, and two combined at 20 megahertz. And often you will be able to determine whether you wanted the channel width to be higher or lower. And in some cases, when you have deterioration in signal, etc., you would want to check for the channel width and the channel type that would be on your wireless network. For 802.11ac, which is our current standard, we have 5 gigahertz band, and it's able to adapt 20, 40, 80, and 160 channel width, which gives you 4 channel. Now, in case where you have a signal bleed or there's interference in your devices, you might want to take a look at how you configure your channel and your channel width on your wireless router or your wireless access point. Here provides you with a table for the 802.11 common Wi-Fi standard and a comparison across. So when we're looking at the B, the 802.11b, that came out a long time ago. B is no longer supported in our current environment. However, B was used for a long time. So the frequency band for B is 2.4 gigahertz, and the transfer rate for B is 11 megabit per second. So compared to A, B is drastically slower, but however, B is able to use longer length signal compared to A. A has higher frequency but in shorter distance. 802.11g about 10-15 years ago was implemented, about 10 years ago. Maximum transfer rate is at 54 megabit per second. And for the bandwidth at 23 megahertz, but it's operating on the frequency band of 2.4. And most of our radio signal and frequency band is at 2.4 gigahertz for our wireless. 802.11n was the previous standard before the AC. It's for the later revision of N, we were able to implement 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz frequency band. And the transfer rate for 802.11n was at 600 megabit per second maximum. So at the max, we're able to transfer approximately 600 megabit per second. Most of the time, you would see that will be right below that or even a lot lower than that depending on how many devices are being used, or how many devices are utilizing data transfer. So on that shared band, we also take a look at the type of data is being transferred. So there's a lot of different factors that would impact your transfer rate as pertain to the standards. 802.11ac is at 2.4 and at 5 gigahertz. It has backward capability to the end, and we can transfer at a lot faster rate, at least 6.9 gigabit per second, so drastically higher than what we've seen in 802.11n. Now AD, AF, and AH are listed here. AF is to be queued for later implementation, so you might see AF, AD being discussed on the internet, or if you look at IEEE website, you can look at the status on how the development of these standards and whether they would be effective in the future or not. Now, all wireless access point would, if we allow it to, if we set it as default, the SSID, it stands for Service Set Identifier. This is the name of our wireless network. It would advertise itself to the rest of your devices. So like, for example, at home, if you have a wireless adapter or wireless access point named, let's say, home network, that home network information is being advertised to all the devices that it sees. So when you buy a new smartphone or a smart TV and you're trying to add to a wireless network, you would search for the wireless network, and you would be seeing all the adjacent wireless network, including home network, for your wireless router. So the default SSID should be changed as far as security practice. We should disable the SSID broadcasting for hidden wireless networks. So if you wanted to hide that, like our example at the hospital, for the nurses, the physicians, and the healthcare worker, we want to disable their SSID so that way, and we would only whitelist the appliances or the systems that needs to be on that wireless network. Access point broadcast SSID in clear text. Now the attacker would utilize this to their advantage, where they would scan, they would check out which networks are available, and then be able to try to circumvent that network by entering that network first, breaking its cryptography, its encryption key in order to enter, and then after that, they would escalate their privileges to be able to access different form of systems or different system on that wireless network. We want to also change our default password, and we want to enable MAC filtering and MAC address. We talked about MAC address last time, which is a physical address that's ingrained on the wireless adapter or the network interface card. And we also need to use port security on our switches and on our system. So when you MAC filter, you add the ID of that system or that MAC address to a list of the access point, and then from there we're able to allow or disallow a specific system. So if the system is not on that list, the system will not be allowed to access our wireless network. So for the next few questions, we can answer that the difference between access point and router. We can say that all wireless routers are access point, and not all access point are wireless router. If a wireless router is standardized with 802.11ac, what are its band and channel width? So for number 6, we can put down that if for 802.11ac, as we looked at the chart information and our notes, we saw that its bands and channel width is 20, 40, 80, 160 megahertz, and its bands are 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. So the bands are here, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and the channel width are 20, 40, 80, and 160 megahertz. To prevent wireless sniffing, we should change SSID settings, and we should hide SSID. We should also change our default password of our access point, because an attacker would be able to scan our wireless network and look for our SSID, and then from there the attacker would then try to access our wireless network by breaking the encryption key or brute forcing the password in order to get in. And we want to implement the rules in order to prevent that. Next, we're going to talk about the physical security of the wireless network through antenna. With the antenna, antenna can be directional or omnidirectional, and directional antennas is to a single direction. If you're looking at most of your wireless router that you purchase in the store or obtain from your service provider, they utilize omnidirectional antenna. That means that it's able to receive signal from all directions, 360 degrees. Where directional antenna can transmit at a single direction, usually at 180 or at 90 to 180 degrees. So now in directional antenna, it's able to receive the signal from the same direction, and it has greater gain than omnidirectional antenna that has narrow radiation pattern. So this is why you see that some wireless router would have multiple antenna in the back for omnidirectional, as omnidirectional antenna signals are weaker compared to directional antenna. And directional antenna, a good example for this is when you look at the old television antenna that people have on their roof, and you can still use it today, to receive like TV signal and such. So in wireless devices like access point and router, we can set up our antenna configuration so that way it can prevent signal bleed into certain area. Like if we don't want certain group of people or certain part of the building to be receiving the signal, we can use directional antenna in comparison to omnidirectional antenna. Or when we have, let's say, a big building where we have to have access point across the first floor of the building, then we can use overlapping omnidirectional antennas on multiple access points, so that way we have coverage. There's no gap in between one access point to the next. So here it shows you the image of how we would use antenna, and power can sometimes reduce or restrict access to set up your access point. So in some company, they would set up like this, where the hallway would get the most signal, but the downside of that is that there's no signal in the back, both left and right side of the rooms. Now to set it up this way is less effective than if we want coverage, is to set it up this way, where we would, instead of placing it in the hallway, we can overlap the omnidirectional antenna by setting it up in different rooms where it would overlap signal. And the way that we would measure signal, you can simply do this with your smartphone, but they do have signal reader. So for the network technician that installed this, right, we would be able to try to detect where's the gap. So in order to cover this gap, what we can do is we can put another access point that's going to be over here to really cover this area, and another one over here. Otherwise, the people who's in this area would not be able to have signal. So as you can see, the placement of the antenna of your wireless access point or router is also crucial, because in some cases we might not want people to see our signal in specific physical area. Then we can look at where we will place that and how we would use our antenna. And you often refer to different zones for network architecture zones. So we would have in this diagram or this topology, we would have more of a hierarchical structure where we have central server, we have some local servers, maybe at some branches, and at each of the branch we would have a switch, and that switch would connect to our access points, and our access points able to connect our users. So for the user computer, let's say a laptop, that user would then connect to the access point. It would switch that to our local systems, and then to be able to access the local server and our central server. Now on both sides, we can have the mobile phone accessing the left side, and then on the right side, we would be able to have the system connection. So here, what we would see is we would see something pretty basic as far as a network that would consist of two separate zones for wireless access. Now, wireless is often seen as a bridge to the wired network, where we would have the wireless access point connecting to a switch, and that switch is bridged to the rest of the wired switch in our network. Guest network should rarely be used because it needs to be isolated away from the main network, in that it would impose vulnerability for your network. So we want this to be separated, and we want it to be disabled when it's not in use, and so it should rarely be used. And if you wanted something more for public and customer and such, you can set up a regular access point, and then to be able to provide them with a number of minutes and hours where they would be able to access that, and then be able to change up the key. Cryptography protocols, we can look at WPA, WEP, and WPA2. And in our current standard, we would use WPA2. And for the 802.11ac, WPA2 stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access 2. This is a replacement of WPA because WPA has vulnerability, is susceptible to password cracking, even though it used strong passphrase on access point. WEP was implemented in 802.11b and 802.11g, but later phased out to be utilized. The 802.11n and 802.11ac uses WPA2. And WEP has known vulnerability, and it should not be used. So WPA and WEP should not be used. We would use WPA2. It has stronger to cryptography, and it can use counter mode with cipher blockchaining message authentication code protocol, which is CCMP. Most of the home access point or the wireless router at home would use Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP, which is an older encryption used with WPA. So if you use that with the wireless router at home, you can reconfigure and make sure that you enable WPA2. Now CCNP is a newer encryption and it should be used with WPA2. It is based on AES, and AES stands for Advanced Encryption Standard, which replaced TKIP. And when you use WPA2, with AES, it ensures confidentiality, as in that it would not have a B-share key. So for the next question, in our assignment question 8, how should wireless access point antenna be placed? We would place the mobile devices that are being used for directional antenna, and then we can overlap antenna signals so that way it would cover all areas physically in the building. Then for question 9, it asks, what's the difference between WPA and WPA2 encryption? WPA is accessible to password crack, not recommended for cryptography in wireless. And WPA2 has stronger encryption, and it is harder to crack. Going back to our notes talk about enterprise mode, and enterprise mode is used for user authentication with credential. We can implement this with the authentication server, where it would issue certificate for authentication. Once each user is successfully authenticated, a certificate would be issued. We can implement expiration on the certificate, or in the case of we wanted to implement radius server with the authentication server or AAA server, we can allow remote authentication and access management with the AAA server or AAA server. Now for the enterprise mode, using the radius server, you would use port 1812 or 1645. These two ports are used to, number 1, verify connectivity, number 2, verify authentication has taken place or shared secret has been issued. In the next part, we're going to cover authentication protocol for wireless. So Authentication Protocol Eap, it stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol. This is a framework that's used for authentication methods, and it uses pairwise master key or PMK. This key is used to encrypt all data that's transmitted between devices. For example, if I have a tablet communicating with a smartphone, so in an using EAP, it uses the pairwise master key. And EAP flexible authentication via secure tunneling, which is Eap fast. This is used with Cisco appliances, and it's used in place of lightweight EAP to support certificate for authentication purposes. Then we have protected EAP, which gives us an extra layer of protection from EAP. It protects the channel, it encapsulates and encrypts EAP conversation using TLS. It requires certificate on the server, and in implementing with Microsoft, it also used MS Chat version 2, which stands for Microsoft Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2. So often you would see PEAP or protected EAP being used in the Microsoft environment. Eap Tunnel Tls is an extension of PEAP, which allows the system to use older authentication methods so it has backward compatibility, such as Peap or TLS tunnel, which requires the server to store the certificate but not issue to the client. So to answer the next question, we need to describe for number 10 the use of Peap in a wireless network. We can use Peap to protect the channels on our wireless network. We can use it to encapsulate and encrypt Eap conversation in TLS tunnel. We can require the certificate to be stored on the server. And when we use with the Microsoft server, we can implement MS Chat version 2. And you can find the answer for Peap on page 5 of your notes. Next, we're going to talk about captive portals. And captive portals are solutions that allows the client to use web browser to authenticate in order to access a network. More and more people are using remote access systems or an interface to be able to remote into their system, like virtual private network. Many companies would use captive portal to allow the user to access their network. Now, what the benefit of this is that the user would be able to utilize free internet access, or if they pay for internet access, they can use the captive portal, or alternatively, we can implement the authentication server concurrently with the captive portal, which is just a website where the user would log in order to access the systems or the resources for the network. Next, we're going to talk about wireless attack. And wireless attack consists of different types, starting with disassociation attack. And this type of attack removed the wireless client from the wireless network. So this type of attack kicked the client out of the wireless network, and using disassociation frame with the access point, they would spoof the MAC address of the victim and impersonate the victim system. When the access point received the frame, it would shut down the connection from the victim and give the access to the attacker. So it disassociates the traffic between the victim and the access point. WPS Wi-Fi protected setup allows the user to configure wireless devices without typing in a passphrase, and it uses 8-digit PIN. So there's a form of attack called WPS attack, where they would brute force the PIN or try to discover the PIN to be able to access the wireless network. Then we also have the rogue AP, which is rogue access point, in which the access point would be placed on the network without official authorization due to the lack of physical security. So they would try to plug that into a specific port or a switch, or turn on the wireless access point that would not be allowed on that network. So the best way to prevent this is we would use whitelisting of MAC, and then we would disable the port that's not being used. Another form of attack is evil twin, and playing on rogue AP. This is a rogue AP that's able to copy the SSID that will be legitimate that would be a copy of the legitimate access point. So in the evil twin attack, the secondary access point, the rogue access point, would be turned on, and it would be able to identify itself as a legitimate access point by using the same SSID. You would see this form of attack being used with Wi-Fi Pineapple or other type of appliances that are being sold in the market today. And Hack5 released Wi-Fi Pineapple. You can visit Hack5 website to be able to look at the type of tools that you can experiment with to understand more on how Evil Twin attack would be used. So Hack5, and on Hack5 website we would be able to look at the devices and the tools. So Wi-Fi Pineapple is used for Evil Twin attack. Next, we're going to talk about jamming attack, and this is to use radio signal on the same frequency that's used on the network to degrade the performance of the frequency or the use of the frequency, and then overcoming attack by using different channel. So jamming attack is often used to take down victim connection by accessing the same frequency or deteriorating that signal for that access point. IV attack is very common. It's called initialization vector attack. And in order to perform this attack, an attacker must scan the network using Wireshark or network monitoring tool. Look for the pre-share key or the IV and be able to use that number to find the pre-share key for the encrypted data. They would use packet injection to add the packets into the data stream and increase the probability of the key to be reused. So they would inject the packet with the information from the data stream and also to increase the time used, so that way they can crack the WEP or encryption. And this can be done in less than a minute, so IV attack is very common, especially in the wireless environment. MFC attack is for near field communication type of devices like radio frequency, door fobs, smart card readers, etc., or even smartphones, remote control, and simply using the standards that's used in the mobile devices to allow them to communicate with other mobile devices in range. So it's able to recognize other systems that has NFC. And you do see some payment system that uses NFC, like point of sale systems, etc. So the attacker would use the MFC reader to detect other MFC devices and then listen in on the type of signal that's being sent from that device. They would use antenna and also booster for the range to intercept the data and to be able to intercept and transfer the data to their device. In some cases, you would see malware like Trojan being used to capture payment and data identity and then to be performed with the MFC attack. Another form of attack is Bluetooth attack. And Bluetooth attack is a short-range attack aiming toward only Bluetooth-enabled devices. So in the group of Bluetooth attack, we have bluejacking, blue snarfing, and bluejugging. So bluejacking is used to send unsolicited messages to nearby Bluetooth devices, possibly for marketing purposes. Blue snarfing is unauthorized access for a Bluetooth device to access email, contact list messages, a lot of the times being used on mobile smartphones or even tablets. Bluejugging is used to gain access to devices and install backdoors so that way the attacker can come back or listen in on the conversation. So what we see is that the pairing of software can prevent discovery mode in broadcasting MAC address, and also changing the default access code for Bluetooth and updating your firmware for Bluetooth is essential to prevent some of these attacks. Wireless replay attack is when the attacker captures the data sent by two systems or two devices, modify it, and then impersonate one of the parties. So in this form of attack, they have to, number one, sniff out the wireless traffic. Number two, be able to